Greeks had lived in Asia Minor for over 2,000 years, but that history came to a bloody end thanks to the genocide committed against them by the Ottoman and Turkish governments. Alongside the Armenians and Assyrians, the Greeks of the Ottoman Empire faced a wave of deportation, dehumanization, and destruction during and after the First World War, which are remembered as some of the bloodiest genocides of the 20th century. Today, on A Day in History, we look at how the Greek population of modern-day Turkey was all but exterminated. This is the third part of our series looking at Ottoman genocides, so check out our earlier videos on the Armenian and Assyrian genocides to see a full picture of the unspeakable crimes committed in the last days of the Ottoman Empire. We also want to thank War Thunder for sponsoring this video. Stick around to find out more about the world's biggest military game and learn how you can jump in with a ton of special bonuses. The Greek, Armenian, and Assyrian genocides were similar in many ways, but the defining feature of their victims was obvious: Christianity. These three minorities represented the vast majority of Christians who lived under the Muslim Ottoman Empire. Political events also put the empire's Greeks in a vulnerable position. Greece had secured independence from the Ottoman Empire in 1823. It was a deep wound to Ottoman pride, made even worse by the continual decay of Ottoman power ever since. As resentment against the new Greek nation simmered, it filtered down and fell upon the Greek minority too. The sparks of genocide began smoldering as early as 1908 with the Young Turk Revolution. The Young Turks were a hyper-nationalist faction who believed in an ethnically Turkish Muslim empire. Their policy of Turkification left no room for non-Turks or non-Muslims, and soon every ethnic minority in the empire was in their crosshairs. In these last years of Ottoman power in Europe, Ottoman authorities harassed ethnic Greeks to encourage them to relocate to Greece itself. Episodes of violence broke out in areas like Thessaloniki and Macedonia, where ethnic Greek leaders were known to disappear or where the bodies of Greek farmers would be found in the wilderness, left behind by Ottoman authorities. But such violence was intermittent and not yet systemic. The Ottomans mainly relied on indirect methods to engage in ethnic cleansing at this stage. Making the Greeks and other Christians leave on their own was easier and less likely to be condemned than removing them with violence. The Ottoman authorities therefore encouraged boycotts of Greek and Armenian businesses to economically and socially isolate them. These boycotts also came with episodes of violence, but disarmament politics enacted by the Ottomans sought to deny the Greeks the chance to protect themselves from it, and the legal system would certainly be no help. Meanwhile, the Ottomans resettled Muslims in Greek areas, and armed settlers at that, to put even more pressure on Greeks to leave. The situation of Greeks and other Christians in the empire was worsened by Ottoman failures in the Balkan Wars between 1912 and 1913. The empire lost almost all of its remaining European territory, save for areas of Thrace, to the Christian Balkan League, and it's perhaps this embarrassment that pushed the Ottomans to even more violent methods. Many of the empire's Christians did choose to flee in the face of rising persecution, but those who stayed faced a wave of intense persecution from 1913. Wholesale massacres occurred in Greek villages near Gallipoli by July of that year. One eyewitness reported villages being left without a house standing, and in others the population was tied up, executed, and burned. As with the Armenian and Assyrian genocides, the Ottomans employed irregular militias and unofficial volunteers in these massacres to give themselves some level of deniability. These methods continued into 1914. One Danish diplomat wrote in his report to his government of armed militias attacking villages and villagers being murdered in their fields or along the roads. The details of what took place are harrowing, he wrote. Women were seduced, girls were ravaged, some of them dying from ill treatment received, and even children were not spared. The goal was intimidation, every village burned might encourage 100 more to flee. On 14th of May 1914, Minister of the Interior and functionally dictator Talat Pasha ordered the cleansing of Greek settlements all along the coast of the Aegean Sea. Local governments were told to encourage Greeks to leave voluntarily, but violence was accepted and inevitable. One victim of this violence was the coastal town of Phasia. Turkish militias descended on the town on June 12, 1914, moving from building to building, eliminating any civilians they came across. The violence sent the town into panic. Hundreds piled onto boats and fled by sea. Others sought sanctuary. A team of French archaeologists in the town managed to save several hundred people by sheltering them in buildings flying the French flag. But perhaps 100 civilians were senselessly murdered in a matter of hours, and virtually all of the population was forced to leave. The first phase of deportations and genocide between 1913 and 1914 led to about 115,000 Greeks from Thrace and 150,000 from the Aegean coast fleeing to Greece. Tens of thousands more were relocated within the Ottoman Empire, where they would either be deported at a later date, culturally assimilated, or in many cases, simply killed. The number of dead Greeks is not fully known at this stage, but a reliable estimate is somewhere in the tens of thousands. The storm clouds of the First World War were looming, which makes this a perfect time to talk about this video's sponsor, War Thunder. War Thunder is the greatest military vehicle combat game ever made. War Thunder lets you engage in exciting PvP battles on air, land, and sea, using over 2,000 different vehicles from across 100 years of history. And you can do it all for free. From World War II battleships to Cold War jet fighters, War Thunder has you covered. Every single one of these vehicles is amazingly detailed with sounds, handling, and stats based on real historical research. The game features an advanced damage system that gives each of these vehicles weak spots and components that could be knocked out in a fight, adding depth and strategy to every encounter. In the Air Superiority update, iconic aircraft like the F-15, Su-27, and JAS-39 Gripen have been added, allowing players to engage in thrilling dogfights over active volcanoes with these formidable additions to the game's lineup. All of this is rendered in stunning 4K resolution, with incredible models, textures, sounds, and music. Take the German Maus supertank, the 188-ton behemoth that never actually made it out of the prototype stage. War Thunder doesn't just add it to the battlefield with all its unique handling and stats, but in our opinion, their model actually looks better than the real-life version. It's that attention to detail and enthusiasm for history that has made War Thunder the amazing success it is today. Join War Thunder with our link for a free bonus pack. New and returning players who haven't played in 6 months are eligible. Grab your pack across PC, Xbox, or PlayStation after your next sign-in. Claim your nation's bonus pack with the USA bonus pack offering 3 premium vehicles, the unique Eagle of Valor Decorator, 100,000 Silver Lions, and 7 premium account days. But act fast. The eruption of the First World War had a complicated effect on the treatment of Greeks. Fears of a Russian invasion causing an Armenian uprising in the east drew Ottoman attention their way. Talat Pasha ordered a halt to deportations and massacres in the western reaches of the empire, if only to avoid antagonizing neutral Greece. Still, the threat of an ethnic Greek rebellion to accompany an invasion by a Christian power, such as Britain, kept the Ottoman authorities weary, and they found ways to continue their genocide anyway. Although mass killings and burning of villages still occurred, the bulk of extermination occurred through forced labor and deportation, which became known as white massacres. Wartime conscription applied to Greeks, but arming them while persecuting them would have been foolish. Instead, young Greek men were conscripted into forced labor battalions, who were assigned grueling physical labor across the empire. These labor battalions were a tacit form of genocide. Cut off from their homes, underfed, and overworked, many of the men who were taken were never expected to make it home. The targeting of men was a useful security measure too. Men were more likely to fight back if they saw what the Ottomans were doing to the women and children left behind, a problem easily solved by forcing them into labor battalions. A Greek diplomat who witnessed one of these labor battalions in 1917 sent a grim report back to Athens. "I saw those wretched men in the hospitals, stretched upon their beds or on the ground, resembling living skeletons, longing for death to end their sufferings." Casualty rates were so high that it was not practical to dig individual graves for everyone. The bodies of the workers who fell were dumped into mass graves, if they were even buried at all. An estimated 200,000 men were forced into these labor battalions, with perhaps 3/4 of them dying before the end of the war. The other pillar of the White Massacres was deportation, in the form of the infamous death marches. Although more strongly associated with the Armenians, tens of thousands of Greeks perished on miserable marches to their new settlement sites. Remaining Greek populations who could not be removed from the empire altogether were relocated to the interior by foot. The logic was that the coastal regions were more vulnerable in the case of an Entente invasion, and dispersing the Greeks among the Muslim and Turkish population inland would help to stamp out their culture. Starvation, dehydration, exhaustion, disease, and mistreatment by the Ottoman or militia guards led to a high attrition rate on the death marches, leaving aside the intentional massacres that occurred along the routes. For more on the death marches, check out our video on the Armenian and Assyrian genocides too. Experiences of genocide often changed by region. The Greeks of the Pontus region along the Black Sea suffered especially harsh treatment. Here, the persecution was overseen by Topal Osman. Osman systematized massacres in outlying Greek villages across Pontus, often gathering the population of a village together in a church or house before setting it on fire, in order to save time compared to burning every building individually. Elsewhere, Greeks in the east, and especially those who lived in close proximity to Armenians or Assyrians, saw their genocides intertwine. Despite their differences in language, ethnicity, and the particularities of their faith, the Christians of the Ottoman Empire often shared the same mass graves. For example, in the province of Diyarbakir, an estimated 200,000 Christians were killed in a few months in 1915, upon the orders of Governor Reshid Bey, most of them Assyrians or Armenians, but among them were thousands of Greeks. By late 1916, Entente forces were occupying islands in the Aegean Sea, Russia was advancing in the Black Sea region, and Greece was increasingly likely to join the war effort against the Ottomans. In response, Ottoman deportation policy intensified in the latter half of the war. Entire towns and districts were designated for depopulation into the interior, subjecting tens of thousands to death marches and other violence. The Pontus region was thoroughly depopulated, out of fear that they would join the advancing Russians. In Samsun province in Pontus, the Greeks were given only a few hours' notice before their deportation. The deportations inevitably went hand in hand with looting, burning, and other crimes, but the Ottomans forced survivors to sign affidavits that officially blamed Armenians for the violence. There were, of course, practically no Armenians left in Pontus at that time. This pattern of deportation, abuse, and outright massacre continued until the Ottoman surrender in October 1918, although this was only a pause, not the end of the genocide. By this point, the removal of Assyrian and Armenian populations was almost entirely complete, and a huge portion of the Greeks had also been removed. In a way, the genocide had already been mostly successful. The Armistice of Mudros on October 30th, 1918 demanded that the Ottomans allow deported Greeks to return home, but the survivors would only find their homes looted, destroyed, or resettled. Furthermore, those who returned home merely opened themselves to persecution when the genocide resumed a few months later. Post-war arrangements saw the dismantling of the Ottoman Empire and the partition of its territory between Britain, France, Italy, and Greece. The vestigial Ottoman authority was quickly challenged by a new Turkish nationalist movement, who sought an independent, ethnically pure Turkish nation in Anatolia. At the center of this movement was Mustafa Kemal Pasha, later known as Ataturk, who would soon reignite the genocide during his fight for Turkish independence. On May 15, 1919, Greek forces landed at the city of Smyrna with the approval of the Entente powers. Greece had been granted permission to occupy the region for security reasons, under the Armistice of Mudros. Smyrna was an ancient city with a large Greek majority population, and for the Greeks, occupying it was a valid strategic choice. It was also a way for them to protect ethnic Greeks from the persecution other Greeks had been enduring for years. For the Turkish nationalists, it was an invasion into the heartland of their idealized post-imperial Turkish nation. The landing at Smyrna is widely considered to be the start of the greco-turkish war. Ataturk was dispatched to Pontus shortly after the Greek occupation of Smyrna. Although it was hundreds of miles removed from the Greek occupation, Ataturk ensured that Pontus was punished for the perceived injustices of their fellow Greeks. The Turkish nationalists openly encouraged mob violence against Greeks and called on Turks to clear their land of, quote, faithless dogs. Over 300 Pontic villages were destroyed, their population almost entirely killed in this persecution after the First World War. By May 1922, Greek military sources reported with despair that practically the entire Greek population of Pontus had been eliminated. Full-scale conflict erupted between Turkey and Greece shortly after the landing at Smyrna. Greece pushed into inland Anatolia through 1920 and 1921, until the nationalist forces under Ataturk, who had assumed effective power over a new Turkish nation, launched a powerful counteroffensive which drove the Greeks back and out of Smyrna by September 1922. Atrocities were reported on both sides over the 3 years of fighting. The Greeks often took violent revenge on the Turkish civilians for the crimes of the Ottomans and Turkish authorities, while the Turks answered Ataturk's call for ethnic cleansing, with a continuation of the Ottoman-era policies of massacre and deportation. The Izmit region in northwest Anatolia, just east of Istanbul, was a typical victim. Greek and Turkish forces were present and fighting in the region from 1920. There, at least 32 villages were burned and 12,000 people were massacred, as the Turks mopped up the last remaining Greeks who hadn't already been deported or killed in previous persecutions. Greek journalist Kostas Faltaitis visited the region during that time and wrote of the horrors he saw. There is nothing left today except ashes and ruins, and the endless corpses of human skeletons that are scattered in the mountains, in the fields, in the forests, and in the ravines. The bloody capstone of the war and the genocide came in September 1922, where the Turkish forces retook Smyrna. Greek citizens were beaten, tortured, and killed en masse in an orgy of violence committed by the victorious Turks. Among the victims was Bishop Chrysostomos Kalafatis, the leading Christian figure of the city, who was handed over to a mob and lynched. Eyewitnesses reported him being stripped, mutilated, and dragged through the street until he expired. On September 13th, a fire broke out in the city. Turkish sources blamed the Greeks, but eyewitnesses reported Turkish soldiers setting fire to Greek homes as the start of it. The fire spread and utterly consumed the Greek and Armenian quarters of the city, but thankfully spared the Muslim and Jewish area. It took several days for the fire to burn out. Estimates for the dead in the burning of Smyrna range from 10,000 to 100,000 or more. Almost all of them were ethnic Greeks. The survivors escaped by piling onto boats in the harbor or huddling on the docks, where Turkish forces kept them contained for days. With their homes destroyed and the Turkish nationalists victorious, the scattered Greek survivors of Smyrna left for Greece, some voluntarily, others deported by the nationalists. The burning of Smyrna was a symbolic end, not just to the war or even to the Greek genocide, but to 2,000 years of Greek settlement in Asia Minor. The greco-turkish war came to an end with the Treaty of Lausanne in July 1923. In the terms of the treaty, Turkey and Greece agreed on an unprecedented population exchange. Turkey's over 1 million ethnic Greeks would be deported to Greece, while Greece's 500,000 Muslims would be deported to Turkey. The population exchange was an assurance of peace and protection, but it was also a chilling conclusion to a saga of persecution. In the end, it ensured that the Greek genocide was almost entirely successful. The Ottomans and then the Turks had wanted only one thing: to get rid of the Greeks. They were willing to do anything to achieve that end: murder, virtual slavery, assimilation, or deportation. As long as they were gone, the perpetrators did not care. That is not to say the treaty was wrong. The population exchange almost certainly saved countless Greeks, and indeed Muslims, from persecution in their original countries. However, it is a grim lesson from history that genocides achieve their stated goals far more often than we'd like to admit. As with all genocides, casualty estimates vary wildly. There were between 2 and 3 million Greeks in Asia Minor at the start of the First World War, and barely a handful left by the end of the Lausanne population exchanges. Scholarly estimates fall somewhere between 300,000 and 1 million dead, with many more deported to Greece or escaping elsewhere into Europe or Russia. Like its Armenian and Assyrian counterparts, justice for the genocide was practically non-existent. Recognition has also been rare, even more so than for the Armenians. Efforts to build peace between Greece and Turkey, especially during the Cold War when they were ostensibly allies, meant that Greece did not push the issue of genocide recognition in the decades afterwards. Greece only officially recognized the genocide in 1994, and only 8 other countries, including Armenia, Germany, and the United States, have officially recognized it. As one might expect, Turkey does not admit any wrongdoing. Moreover, the personal involvement of Ataturk in the persecution of Greeks makes the Greek genocide an especially thorny issue for nationalists, who have, at various times, wavered between denial or celebration of the anti-Greek actions of Turkey's premier national hero. Still, the genocide's legacy lives on in the millions of people whose ancestors were killed or displaced, in the ethnic makeup of the regions where Greeks were murdered or torn away, and in the tension that endures between Greece and Turkey to this day. Once again, a huge thank you to War Thunder for sponsoring this video. And don't forget to check the link in the description and download War Thunder completely for free today. If you enjoyed this video, do us a favor and leave a like or subscribe to our channel. And we encourage you to learn more about the Armenian and Assyrian genocides by checking out our other videos.